Oh, look at that.
Welcome to the lab at Canvas. We are back again for week 2. Thank you, everybody who's here, everybody who is joining us online. A quick note before we get started, if you are watching the live stream, please click the YouTube link on our website. It will take you directly to the live stream on the YouTube platform where there is a chat feature and you can participate in the discussion with us. We have Tamara once again manning the chat and she will share your comments with us. So please click the YouTube link, be on the YouTube app, and put all your comments into the chat. For those of you here, you don't have to worry about that. You just talk. We'll stick a mic in front of you so that the people online can also hear, and we'll go from there. So, last week we were talking about what images of God do we have in our youth, and how we were impacted by those. We sent our lab rats off after our first meeting to go do some research, and they came back with all this research on all different topics. Some of that research is actually online on our website. Come on in, have a seat. And you can take a look at that research whenever, just to dive in deeper. We'll hit a little bit of it tonight, but we compared Christianity, imagery in Christianity to other religions. We talked a little bit about the history of how we got to the imagery that we now have. And we're going to dig a little bit into that tonight, but if you want to see more, check out the website. Episode 2 of the Lab Rats get-together session is, you're going to see more. You'll see a little bit tonight, but there's more online. So let me just put it that way.
Yeah.
So
really, I mean, tonight is about unpacking how we got to where we got to, right? And really, it's about taking centuries.
And we're just going to cover it real quick.
We're going to cover it real quick. But what's interesting is that, for us, what we saw was over time, there was, just a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And what we're going to get into is, why did some things stay? Why did some things not stay? How did we evolve to where we're at right now in terms of the different images of God that is in our culture and is in our faith?
Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we feel about that, because I'm a feely person and I want to hit the feels. So I will be asking you about your feels.
So you want to start?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to skip over a bunch of stuff and jump straight into how Christianity compares to our Abrahamic sibling religions, Islam and Judaism.
Yep.
So we can roll the first video.
So, from the Abrahamic religions, what I'm essentially talking about, aside from our own, is Judaism and Islam.
Mm-hmm.
Both of these religions practice aniconism. And aniconism is basically not having any images of God, and in fact, forbidding images of God because it would lead to idolatry or the creation of idols. I'm going to ask a similar question again. What do we think the absence of imagery in this case might do for the followers of these religions?
Many times it has been said how incomprehensible our God is. God's ways are not our ways. His ways are above our ways. He would see things that we do not see. If we were to kind of try to cast and create an image, it helps us to start defining and boxing and categorizing.
James?
Well, I've spent a lot of time studying this kind of stuff, so I really like this topic a lot. There's this great book that I read by J. Richard Middleton, and it's impossible to summarize that book because it's got a lot of stuff in there. So the basic idea in his book, if I tried to boil it down, which I'm not going to do justice, is that the Judaic idea of the image of God is not a novel idea. It was not an original idea. They stole that concept from ancient Mesopotamia. And so you can't really understand the right way that they look at it unless you understand the creation story that it's a part of. And you can't really understand that unless you understand all the other creation stories that are surrounding.
Mm-hmm.
So if you summarize all those creation stories of ancient Near East Mesopotamia, whether it's Marduk, Amun-Ra, Enlil, they're all very similar in that there's multiple gods. They're very violent. They are at war with each other constantly. And either through their sexual reproduction or through the violence of bloodshed of their war, creation develops and mankind is produced. And the sole purpose of man is to serve the gods. And to serve the gods, they put an image of God either in the king or the priest. So the theology kind of creates a canopy for the political systems of the day. So along comes this tribe who's captive and in captivity in Babylon, and they say, we don't like that story, so we're going to tell a completely different story. And instead of a violent pantheon of gods, they talk about a gracious God who plants a garden and gives it to man and puts his image in man, women and men equally. And so the image of God doesn't rest with the king or the priest, it rests on everybody. There is no hierarchy. It's total flat structure. And you're not here to serve the God. God's here to serve you. You don't have to produce food for the gods. He's given a garden for you. And it's just a beautiful story. And in that context, it would have been very, very dissident political thing to stand up to Nebuchadnezzar and say, for you, it's okay for you to put us in bondage and make bricks for you or for Pharaoh or whoever. But our God is a liberating God. He's going to set us free eventually because this is not right. So their theology creates a context for liberating people from hierarchy, from people having dominion over each other. Christianity somewhere lost the plot and ended up going right back to dominance and competition. But that original story of the creation narratives is a beautiful story.
Does anybody want to kick us off and talk about why or what they have found on why we are no longer, or why we are not aniconistic?
The Renaissance.
I was going to say, I think Michelle could probably speak to this question better than I could, but the history of Christianity is very complex. We've been fighting about it for 2,000 years, but it really didn't come into like a form where we could like put a label on it until Ambrose and Constantine. And so it took the reflection of the political system of its day, which was the Roman political system. That's what gave birth to our versions of Christianity. If you read Joseph Campbell's The Power of Myth, or if you read Science or Atheist Today, when they say Christian, what they really mean is Roman Catholic, because that's what shapes everything that comes after it. The Protestant comes after that, the Protestant Reformation, the Eastern Orthodox Church comes after that. So history, for better or for worse, equates Christianity with the Roman Catholic tradition, which is modeled on the Roman government, which sees Caesar as God. And so it was a very logical step to create an image of our God that modeled what the political power, I think.
The idea as James said, of having imperial iconography. Also, you've got to remember that for centuries people were illiterate. We've mentioned this before. And the images of the church were absolutely necessary in order to promote the religion. People needed to see the stories of the Bible on the doors of the church because they needed to know that they needed to be saved. And they needed to know what they believed. And they had to have some kind of way of expressing that.
Okay.
Welcome back.
So, quick review. Aniconism. What is it? I didn't know that word, but when we started this journey, so as a lab rat, that was a new word for me, and now I'm like, ooh, aniconism, the forbiddance of God imagery. So, Islam and Judaism, and I don't know if Yoram and Lynn are online, but if they are, weigh in.
Because it was brought up last week.
What?
Yoram brought it up last week in the chat.
Yes, he did.
That the Jewish faith is aniconistic, and they didn't have to worry about this stuff.
Right. And I wonder, how true is that? I mean, I'm sure it's true to a point, but...
There are several well-known monuments of Judaism. Should I say it again?
Yes.
It's on.
Is this on? It doesn't like me.
Is it...
No, it's on. They just-
Hello? Hello? I'm not broadcasting. What's happening?
You are very clear on the video. I do not know why it's not coming out.
All right.
Okay. Yeah,
If the
just keep
people
going.
online
If
can
they-
hear you,
if the
keep
people
talking.
online
If the
into it, yeah.
people online can hear me, that's just fine. I don't care. There are several known monuments of Jewish art that do use iconography, and that's the use of symbols and images. And so it's not completely devoid of. In Islam, it's another considerably different issue, because if you use imagery of any kind, it's heretical. There it is. It's heretical, and you can be just completely drummed out, if not killed, if you create an image in Islamic art, in Islamic religious art. Non-religious art is allowable. You can have images in non-religious art in Islamic culture. But Dura Europos is a monument in the Near East, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's an ancient site where the Jewish faith had a synagogue which was decorated in frescoes with images of David and of Moses and of really relevant images of people, not of God, but this was very unusual for Jewish art. And then in Islamic Spain, that became Catholic Spain, there were several very important manuscripts, and the imagery of European Christianity was mixed in with the decoration of Islamic art with the Jewish topic, and this was called the Golden Haggadah. And it's interesting that there are manuscripts, there are frescoes in Jewish art.
So, what I found fascinating with what James contributed in that clip is that my interpretation is that this region at some point said God is being represented in these rulers and kings, and there's a mirror there.
The image of God was placed in the
Yeah.
the ruler or the Priest.
Right. And that is not okay. And so a people came and said, you know what? We're going to be aniconistic. We're going to get rid of that.
Because
And-
the image is in everyone, so you can't capture one image. One image doesn't exist.
Right.
It's spread across.
And then what we heard last week, as well as in that clip, is at some point Christianity went, when we got adopted in Rome, and we came back and went Caesar. And we went and took a head of state and said, image of God kind of looks like Caesar. And we got right back to,
Well, before we jump
Right.
into Rome, I'm still curious as to, do people hold images, at least in their minds, even if they're not drawn, based on the language and the texts? Because, again, our Bible is full of he and father, and then we have certain imagery that talks about God in different ways. The text can give me personally imagery. What do you all think about how does aniconism actually work, as far as like if we don't draw an image of God doesn't exist? Or do images of God exist simply based on text and language? What do you guys think about that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So
do you need pictures to have an image?
Well, I think my problem is that a picture is an image.
okay.
Hey, hold on. What I mean is, like, if we did not have, I have to stand up, by the way. If we did not have actual pictures and images, right, can you still form something in your mind that is akin to an image?
Yes, of course. You have a concept of God as opposed to a picture of God. And I think, skipping ahead, the idea of our creating what we thought God looked like on a canvas was very important, because it sort of demonstrated what we have in mind about what God is. But I think that in order to access a community of concepts, you have to have pictures to make it available to a community of believers. And I think that the closest thing anybody had is the idea of hierarchical scale, not just from Rome, but from time immemorial, that there are different levels of being. And regardless of gender or of power struggles, that you have to have some awareness of a greater being than yourself. And so it was convenient for Romans to place what they knew as hierarchy as that kind of concept, as also their images of God.
So Tina, earlier you were bobbing your head.
Mm-hmm.
What were you thinking?
Well,
Thank you, Michelle.
even if you're thinking of other books beyond the Bible, and I was thinking about the book I'm reading for a book club, for Campus Book Club right now, the images come in my head of what I think these people look like regardless, and that's based on my experience and my life, how I interpret whatever the author is writing. And so people who are being told, even if they're not reading stories, they're hearing stories because they were not literate, they're still going to be creating images in their head, and it's based on their current life experiences.
would say so. Anybody else? James?
I think one of the things that's most interesting to me is that even though we're prohibited in our text from creating images, the image of God is put in our heads very early in the text. In the creation stories, God personifies himself and uses language like God walked in the garden, right? We, in our human brains, when we think of somebody walking, we immediately personify that. So we create images that we can relate to, and I think the purpose of the language was relational more than anything. So for me, when I go through these texts, one of the big things is power. How do we use power? And I think the subversiveness of our creation story is that power is distributed to everybody equally. It's not to be abused by just one person. And God models that right at the beginning by bringing himself down to our level and walking in the garden instead of just shouting things from clouds or whatever. So I just think the imagery everywhere in the Old Testament is just fascinating for bringing us and inviting us into relationship with God and not running from God. I mean, the first story of humans is running from God, and what does God do? He pursues them. And he's been doing it ever since. So I just think that image is an awesome image.
Great. Anybody else? Anything online, Tamara? All right, well, we got to move.
Yeah.
Oh, shoot.
Yep.
Bummer. All right. Well, so we can't even get into Rome?
Let's get into Rome. Who cares? Why not?
All right. I do think it's fascinating that what James said about when Rome adopted Christianity, Christianity began to take on the nature, the characteristics of the Roman Empire, right? So you have a God that begins to look like Caesar. You have Christianity that begins to grow like an empire. Are we aniconistic because of Rome? Did we leave behind this Jewish notion of no symbols for
You mean,
God?
are we no longer aniconist?
Are we no longer aniconistic because of
Rome.
Rome? What do you guys think? No. Michelle says no. It's not to do with Rome.
We're aniconistic because we don't want to put God in a box.
No. Why are we not aniconistic?
Oh, why do we use images
Yes.
in our world?
We
about
obviously
God?
use images in Christianity.
Well, there was a huge squabble all through the Middle Ages about this whole issue. And
I know.
you should have. It would have been fun.
Tan is commenting over there about having, should have taken Michelle's class.
But the thing is that there has been tension between you can't put God in a box and how do you teach the people about God if you don't use pictures? Because a lot of the Bible is narrative. And you have to be able to show the story, tell the story. It's how the theater developed because you wanted to play out the stories of Adam and Eve. You wanted to play out the stories of David and Goliath. You wanted to play the stories of Jesus preaching to the crowds. And the only way you can do it is by representation. You can't do it all the time. Yes, you can do it in an abstract, verbal way, but it's so much more powerful if you use an image to describe. However, there were people all over the continent of Europe who thought that was heretical and that you shouldn't use images. And so that tension has always been going on. When the Protestant Reformation came along, what did they do? They got rid of all the pictures in all the churches and had plain walls. Why? Because the Catholic powerhouse was corrupt and they didn't want to spend money and they didn't want to spend time on making images. So it's a tension that we've been playing with for thousands of years.
Yes. At the same time, oh, Tan wants to talk.
All right. One of the things that I did learn through Michelle, and one thing that I also kind of forgot, was the fact that we have so many people that are literate is a relatively new thing. Most people couldn't read. Most of the stories were spoken, and would probably need to be, as you said, played out. So the fact of having images in terms of a performer or pictures or something like that might really have served a big deal. And Michelle, I think I remember you. I don't probably in a later talk how important it was to have images to communicate to people that can't read.
But that didn't seem to be a problem for Jews or Muslims, did it?
Well, the Jews,
Is that why Christianity spread wider and faster? I don't know.
the Jews memorized everything. They had an oral tradition. And the rabbi would be the one that would communicate the scriptures orally to the people. And the same goes for the Quran. The Quran was written down, but only a few people could read it.
Oh, so we're just really bad at memorizing our texts, is what it is.
No, we can read for ourselves, and that's a different thing altogether. Really, the seminal moment was when the printing press was invented. And they could disseminate text, and people could read in their own language as opposed to Latin or whatever, Greek.
All right.
Can I just say one thing? I know I talk too much, but
You don't talk
No,
too much, James. You don't
certainly
talk
not.
too much.
What you say is interesting.
One of the things that I think is interesting is way before Rome, right? We have captured in our Old Testament that we made this transition a long time ago. So when the people came out of Egypt, they were led by judges for a while, and eventually they cry out to God, or they cry out to the judges and the prophets, and they say, "We want a king, just like all the other nations." And God tells Samuel, "That's not a rejection of you guys, that's a rejection of me." So right at the very beginning of our story, we reject this God's use of power and throw it away and adopt all the other stuff. So our creation story sets us free from that. And only a
There we
couple
go.
thousand years later, we get sucked right back into it, and we want to be just like all those nations. And by the time we get to Solomon building a temple for the God who can't be contained, he's using slave labor to build that temple. So the God who sets slaves free, the king of that country later uses slaves to build a temple for a God that says we should not have slaves. And we've already gone off the rails. So we just repeat that process over and over. We repeat it with Rome. We repeat it over and over. We repeat it in the United States of America, where we think we're the ones that should be saving the whole world. That's the church's job, right? It's not a nation state's job. So I think when we lose sight of the image of God theologically, it creates all kinds of problems with political power.
So let's move on into Jesus, because Jesus is one thing that does separate us from everybody else. Let's talk about Jesus. Can we roll the next video?
God the Father, God Almighty. But let's talk about Jesus. Now, we know that the image of Jesus has always been around, essentially, right? And Tan, I think you have mentioned before that there's a lot of what I can just say is adaptability of Jesus
Absolutely.
to the region, to the followers. And what I want to kind of talk about is the acceptability of Jesus and the imagery of Jesus.
There's a church in Kenya that I found they had created the Stations of the Cross, and they got local artists to create the images. In fact, the second one from the right on the top is from it. And they put in the background, and I don't know if you can see it from here, but the local town, imagery from the local town in Kenya is actually painted in the background behind these depictions. And of course, the locals are portrayed as all the characters in the story. And they were talking about how excited these people were to connect with this imagery, because they felt like, oh, this is our God.
That's beautiful.
You know, this is a God that cares about us. And so it was fascinating to see that, like, okay, yeah, is that what it would have looked like in Israel? Or, you know, no, but is this the story, and is it for these people? Yes.
Mm-hmm. I think the localized expressions and the cultural expressions are a better reflection of the original creation story of the image of God resting in all of us equally. And it kind of ties into the gospel message at the Nativity when the angels say, I bring you good news for all people, that God is with us. Because when God looks like us, then he really does feel like he's with us. Mm-hmm. So it's nice.
Yes.
Well,
The reason I wanted to interject is that's not new. The cathedrals of Europe are populated by statues of the community. And those are people that were actually there and who contributed to the building of the church. And it's underlying your point that it makes it relevant to the community. And I think that's what we forget when we go touring through these monumental architectural wonders, that these were built by the community for the community as an expression of the community, and the statues and the stained glass windows and everything about the cathedrals and the churches of all of Europe, and I would even guess of Byzantium, are populated by images of the people who built the churches.
And I know you want to move forward, but one additional thing that I personally found very, very fascinating, which again made sense, was that it wasn't, I mean, we can talk about Jesus, but as it was, most Roman Catholics were the ones that are primarily the ones getting purchase in Southeast Asia, the number of icons and images of Mary as well.
I just transitioned our visual aid to let's talk about
you're like a human remote control. I like it too.
So I'm gonna let you finish your thought, but you know, I don't think we could escape tonight's discussion without talking about Mary. And let me kind of set up where I want to take this, right? We understand that, you know, there was a lot of discussion when it came to God the Father and the images of God the Father, right? Universally, it seemed like images of Jesus, A-okay, right? And it also seemed like imagery of Mary, from the very simple to the almost divine,
to actual
divine, was also A-okay. And I think one of the things that I would like us to discuss is, why do we think Mary is such a big deal? And so, Tan, why is Mary such a big deal?
Wow, there are so many reasons why Mary is such a big deal. Mary is such a big deal. I know in certain cultures it was an easy transition from the mother goddess, mother fertility goddess. It was an easy bridge. It was an easy connection from there.
I think that Mary is even more so. She's the sort of acceptability of women in a culture that doesn't accept women. She's a prime example of a human that is godly in her response to Gabriel when she says, "My soul magnifies the Lord."
I think we want that to be the truth. I think we want Mary to tell us that we are special, and yet at the same time, Mary's role was to be quiet and to give birth. And I'm getting a little like in a whole nother area, but
other area.
But there's a lot of I find it to be problematic.
May I say
You
one more
find
thing?
What part to be problematic?
All of it.
Mary is a problem.
I find the way that we need Mary to be problematic because God doesn't give us what we need. Because God doesn't give us the feminine side. We have to go to Mary to get it. We have to turn to Mary for that imagery. We have to turn to Mary for that connection. We have to turn to Mary for our value. We don't get it from Jesus. We don't get it from God. That's the problem that I have with the imagery that has been presented throughout the years.
I think that's probably absolutely true. The imagery is very problematic.
God of itself, I'm not saying is problematic.
It's the imagery
The imagery is problematic.
and considering we're in a very paternalistic, always have been a very paternalistic patriarchal society, it makes sense in a way of why the imagery would ignore any of those like feminine motherly portions that are in our own stories of creation type thing, right?
I bounce back and forth because I mean, for me, I have heard of. I can only relate partially, but I mean I have heard of many people growing up, trying to repurpose is not the correct word, but they made a conscious effort saying, "Mother God," using feminine terms. We talked very briefly that it would be the he is supposed to be represent the global he, but in our culture and over years and years and years of he, it's become from gender neutral to gendered. And if we try to counterculture that, it becomes counterculture. We're trying to say Mother God. People give you weird looks. Some people might express understanding and see the importance of it, but it would be an interesting example and a question that I have posed to people, like, so what's the problem with Mother God? And a lot of people are like, oh, it just makes me uncomfortable. I'm like,
I personally believe that the Bible is the most generous book towards women that's ever been written.
I would
Now, we
agree
could
in
have
many
that
regards.
conversation outside of the concept of the image of God. I think it's rooted in the image of God, but it's hard to get into that in this context.
Well, it's also hard too because I feel like the distortions that have happened over time don't reflect the true religion.
Absolutely.
They don't reflect our true God. They don't reflect the nature of that even Jesus was teaching us,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And we as human beings are so good at distorting things, at twisting things, at coming at them and changing them into manipulations for power. And I think that this topic is one of those examples of power twisting imagery to pass down a certain.
It's absolutely, I would agree with you 100%.
So I'm going to take, sorry.
If you think about Christianity as the religion of Jesus, it is completely different than what people have transformed it into.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about Mary as the mother who bore Jesus and who lived in a simple little town in the backwaters of the Roman Empire, and who wasn't particularly valued in her own world, she's a whole lot different than the Madonna that we see emblazoned in the churches of Europe.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to offer to you that whole idea of the Madonna emblazoned in the churches of Europe is just as much a political manifestation of the male-dominated society as anything else.
Welcome back. There's a lot to unpack in that segment, wasn't there? I do want to spend some time just kind of setting up where I think we are after that segment, right? We started by talking about the images of God that we all hold. Some of us have that Zeusian image, right? Some of us have images bigger than that. But at the end of the day, really what we're talking about is how do we connect with God? How do we have a relationship with God? What is the image? What is that sense that we have? And what we talked about in that clip is, if it's not the Zeus, and if it's not aniconism, the relationship that we build necessitates that we need to connect to Jesus. We need to connect to Mary if we want to have some sort of relational, kind of human side of things connection. And the adaptability of Jesus, the adaptability of Mary kind of opens that up a little bit if the Zeus is something that you reject, if aniconism is not really something that will work for connection. I think what's interesting and where we got to is it's a little messy, right? And I want to just, before we dive into anything specific, I want to just open it up to see if anybody had any thoughts or any comments about, where we are in our conversation, where we are in terms of the things we've discussed so far. This side has been kind of quiet. I'm going to pick on you guys a little bit.
I noticed that when I was talking about Mary, you were nodding a bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, everything you said was just so spot on. It's hard to add a whole lot to that. And we first talked about Jesus and the human side of Jesus and the way that Jesus is depicted in different artistic renderings. And just to comment on that, I was thinking about like the benefits of that, of like seeing some of yourself in Jesus. You should be finding yourself within the biblical story, and certainly Jesus who came down to have a fully human experience, to relate to human beings in a way that no God in any other religion had ever done before. It was like a very unique thing. And then on the other hand, you have to balance that with making sure that your Jesus doesn't become the champion for your specific nation or cause and exclude others. So, I mean, that's how do you balance that? How do you make sure that you're seeing Jesus in your immigrant neighbors, in the people that are completely on the other side of the world from you, that you see Jesus in everybody, but you also see yourself in Jesus.
Yeah. I agree. I was wondering too, thank you so much. Was it new for anybody to see all the different global depictions of Jesus? Because I know that, like, growing up in our Western culture, Jesus looks a very particular way. We don't always see a black Jesus or an indigenous Jesus or a Asian Jesus. So had any of you seen any of these pictures before, or was it a little bit novel for you all to learn about how much Jesus has been adapted for different cultures? No?
Nothing new?
Nothing new?
I think when I was younger, it would have been surprising, but by now I've already seen them all.
Mary?
Yep, that was exactly what I was gonna say. 55 years ago, it would have been out of my experience because I grew up in a very, an area that was all white and rural, and I would not have seen any of that in my church. And I don't remember seeing anything other than pictures in our Bibles of, the various Bible stories, and they were all the traditional white Western images.
Let's talk about Mary.
Okay.
Well, I think we all, I felt something on that stage on that day talking about Mary. And I think I saw a lot of nodding heads too, in terms of the role that Mary seems to have, the necessity of the role, I suppose. And so I think my first question is, do you guys agree? Do you all agree with the necessity that Mary seems to have?
Well, and does Mary work for you? Is Mary an image that you actually do connect with and relate to and think is a decent feminine image of God or not? Why or why not? You're shaking your head.
I grew up Catholic where Mary is revered more so I think than in other religions, and even that I never connected with Mary in that feminine depiction of God type of way. Never. I think she was very much a supporting actor, a background character, in the way that she was taught, I think it falls very short of what I would have liked to have seen taught to everybody. I think that there are lots of places within the Bible where women are, Jesus especially shows that women are valued, and he gives power to women. He flips the script on what society is thinking about women. I think it's no accident that the first people to see to witness or have knowledge of the resurrection were women, who then technically delivered the first sermon and were the first ones to preach about the resurrection of Jesus. But that is brushed under the rug, and it's not something that we talk about. So where are women getting the connection that they need to God? Where are they seeing themselves in God and in the biblical story?
Anybody else?
You don't want to hear what I have to say.
Steven?
Well,
I just wanted to say that the expressions around the deficiencies of Mary as a symbol it felt very novel to me, because I never grew up talking about Mary in church at all. So I think as a starting point, it's interesting and fascinating to know that there is this, I guess, need for us to have this motherly aspect of God talked about, and I just thought that was interesting.
All right, Michelle.
I really want to take issue with the idea that Mary is God, because she's not. She's a human.
absolutely.
And she's-
Absolutely.
But what I will say is we have seen Mary as a proxy for people to speak to
She's-
connect with.
Even in the Catholic tradition, she's considered an intercessor, not as a substitute for Christ. But it does get confusing.
It gets confusing, but that's what I want. I want to speak plainly on it, that okay, according to the rules, that's not how you should connect to Mary. But at the end of the day,
Well, I just read this book, right, by this woman who, her book is called God is a Black Woman. And she went on a pilgrimage to find Black Madonnas, particularly in France, right? The Black Madonna became her proxy image to be able to connect with God. Now, she's not thinking Mary is God, but she is using the imagery that was originally assigned to Mary in a new way. And I think a lot of people have used Mary in that way from time to time.
You know, however I think you can relate to and with God is a good thing. But I think you have to be very clear about who's in what role. And I'm always very concerned about the specificity of the players in the play, because you know, God is God, Christ is God incarnate, and that's that. The church, through many power issues and power politics, have had different roles for Mary, and there's this whole conundrum of, you know, the Immaculate Conception and all of this. And frankly, I think it's just distracting us from the real point of it all, and that's that God loves us. And that's just the basic ethos for me of our faith. But I also think that Mary is a very fine example of a good woman who fits well into her culture, because it's she who prods Jesus to convert the water into wine. I mean, to talk about the nagging mother, but she realizes and she accepts who he is, and she knows what he can do, and she is absolutely 100% the person who trusts him to be himself. And she shows that with her actions and with her words. And I think that's something we often miss, is that she is really very much a woman of great faith and trust in God. And gender or no gender, this is an example for everybody that she knows who she's dealing with. And there's no vacillation in her mind at all. And I think that is an incredible example. I will now be quiet.
She does that from the very beginning of the Magnificat. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Mary does have agency. She does have choice. Huge.
We better move along or we're
Yeah.
going to run out of time. So, after all of our discussions, how comfortable are we with with our images of God now, particularly our Western images? So, let's see where the lab rats landed, and then we'll chime in
And we'll wrap up.
and wrap up.
How I want to wrap this up is, now that we've confronted it and we've kind of done some dissection, the question is, how comfortable do we feel, this group at this table, with where we are now?
How comfortable am I? It is the reason why it is difficult for me to answer is because I don't place the priority necessarily on my own comfort, because I have seen how useful and how important these images can be to have certain people have a genuine connection with God. And at the same time, we have had it expressed here where those certain images can also be just as deeply painful, conflicting, frustrating. And so it's extremely difficult for me to know. For me, perhaps I'm on the more apathetic side. People will do as they will. But it is something for me that I cannot make a decision because I have seen how the strong evidence and the importance of it on both sides.
I think for me, like, I came in with God very much, my view of God, of the image of God, was very much more kind of in nature from some of the stories that we share with our Abrahamic siblings. For me, because I've never been personally able to have that image of the old white guy God. Like, I've seen images, but like to me that just isn't God. Like, for me, like seeing more like evidence of like the nature based, like that was like kind of coming to me like, okay, like you're too big for me to understand who you are, but kind of in ways of nature, like I can kind of see you type thing.
My thought is that if my image of God remains stagnant, so does my faith. I think that as time goes on, as you live your life, you have to have a changing image of who God is, because as you live your life, you see so many different glimpses of Him.
Well, I think there's no doubt among the table here that I came into this with a lot of baggage around this particular image. This, and, you know, the research that I've been doing is all about how damaging this image has been. So I'm reading account after count of how this image has been painful for the Black community, for other minority groups, for women, for the LGBTQ community. I have gone through this world feeling inferior in so many ways because of this image. So, do we have a problem with this image? Yes, I have a problem with this image.
I have a problem with this image too, for different reasons than you, but I can totally understand why you have those images or those issues. So I've always been attracted to dissidents. I don't know what that is about, but I have been. I read every dissident book I can get my hands on. And when I read the text of our scriptures, I see that voice. I hear that voice everywhere. And our creation story is just such a powerful example. And so for me, when I want to really experience the presence or the image of God, I try to find people who are willing to ask these kinds of questions. So I really am excited that you guys created this space for this diverse group of people to have this conversation, because Jesus says, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them, right? So his image, all the way from the very beginning, has rested in all of us equally. And when we gather together, my warped little image of God looking like me or God looking like my tribe gets expanded immediately because I'm surrounded with by people who don't look like me. They're from a different gender, they're from a different race, they identify completely different pronouns than I do. And so there's 2 quotes that have always been really important to me, and I think Tony Campolo is one, and he has this great story where he says, tell me about this God that you don't believe in, because I probably don't believe in him either. So I just think that's so funny, because as people describe it, right, the more we go down that road, you eventually get to a point where, like, I can't pick up what this person's laying down. That doesn't sound like the God I believe in. And the other one is Anne Lamott, and she says, it's pretty safe to say that when God hates all the same people that we hate, we've made God in our image instead of God making us in his image. And I just like those. So I really try to live my life every day. If I approach somebody and they frustrate me, or I get so wrapped up that it pushes me to the edges of my pacifism, I go, this person's created in the image and likeness of God. And the feelings that I have towards them right now are actually directed towards God. And if my problem is with that person, then I have serious problems with my continuity with my theology. So I like that I don't have to be able to explain philosophical concepts like personhood and nature. I can just tell a simple story and say, if I have a problem with you, the problem is with me, right? My theology supports that, and I like that.
Well, we're running short on time, but what I wanted to kind of give you guys a sneak peek of for next time is, so now we've laid bare the situation on the table, so to speak, right? The very first session we talked about our own personal imagery, what we grew up with, and in this session we started putting names to things, aniconism, right? And starting to look at where we were, how we got to where we are. And what I'm really excited about is that next time we're actually not going to watch the lab rats.
We won't. We're going to have even more time to talk, guys. We're going to really dig into it.
And I think all the lab rats here actually took us.
The lab rats are like,
phew, we don't have to watch ourselves. Because there was an exercise that we did in the third session with the lab rats that we're going to bring into the space. Yeah. And they're all excited. So, and I'm not going to be like teasing you completely. What we're going to try to do next time is we're going to try to imagine the opposite of the Zeus image of God. And we have a really interesting exercise to do that. But we're going to try to imagine, what if the Zeus God was not let out of the bag? What if it looked different? And where would we be? And what would things look like? And how would we connect with God if that was not the one that we all know and so very familiar with? And so that's what we're going to do next time. And the reason why I'm teasing this is because we've done the homework now. We've talked through the last two sessions. We have a really good sense of where we are, what the issues are. And next time is about rolling up our sleeves and really getting into it.
Yeah. The next two sessions. Anybody have any final thoughts before we close it out? Anything you need to get off your chest or want to react to? All right. Then we'll say good night, and we will see you all back here next week. Please come back. Please bring a friend. Next week, it should be really interesting. I'm really looking forward to it. And everything is online. So if anybody needs to catch up with anything, it's online. If you want to go back and watch any videos, they're online. I'll be putting out Lab Rats episode 2 tonight. So you'll have that in its entirety. And then we'll just keep going.
Yep. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us online. And we'll see everybody next week.
Yeah.